everyone. Welcome to Voices of Customer Experience. I'm your host, Crystal Garrett. And in our podcast today, Worthix CEO Guilherme Cerqueira caught up with former FICO CEO and research fellow Larry Rosenberger after their presentation at FICO World 2018 to discuss the 4 pillars of behavior analytics. Let's hear what they have to say.
Larry, first of all, welcome to Worthix podcast. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be able to interview you and share your experience with your audience.
Thank you.
I know you've been working as a data scientist for a while now. Would you please tell us a bit about your successful career from a recent grad all the way to FICO's CEO position?
Sure. So I graduated from operations research with, I think, 2 masters in 1974. And then I found this little company, Fair Isaac, then now known better as FICO. 2 founders, Bill Fair and Earl Isaac, hence Fair Isaac, and now FICO. And when I started, I estimate that there were about 30 people, and there are about 20 professionals. And now today, we have about 3,500 employees. So I've seen a factor of 100 of growth. And I started as what we would call today a data scientist working on projects for our clients. And then I worked with some of our bigger clients who wanted to do innovative things. And so I started to try to come up with new solutions, which then led me to leading R&D or analytic R&D. And then in 1991, I was asked to take the role of a CEO. I wasn't looking for that. So as I started as a young, out-of-school data scientist, I had no idea that I would end up 17 years later being a CEO. So I did that for about a little more than 8 years. And then we brought a new CEO in, and I led R&D again, which I thought to myself, I was a pretty decent CEO, but I'm maybe a better R&D leader. And I did that for another 8 years or so when the next CEO came in, and he made an organizational mistake immediately, and he dropped my successor right in my lap. So I put him in place as leading research, especially for analytic research. And so I became a research fellow. And I've been doing that for not quite a decade. And it gives me the opportunity to several things. One, think about the biggest idea that we can come up with in using data and analytics to create solutions. We typically call that business analytics. And over that career, which is now 40 plus years and counting, I'd be happy to talk about the evolution of business analytics from our point of view, that is Fair Isaac's point of view. And we focused most of our time in the 70s and 80s working on predictive analytics. We would do application credit risk scores, customized for one client at a time. And somewhere in the middle of the 80s, we got this idea of using credit bureau data that would work for everyone. And so what came out of that was the FICO score. And that was also the genesis for the next evolution of business analytics. And we came up, and this is Bill Fair as a technical guy, even though he was the CEO. And we together we came up with an idea. It's called adaptive control. It comes from Richard Bellman. At that point was at AT&T Labs and wrote a book about adaptive control. And I read that and I said, I think we can make this work. So adaptive control, it's sometimes called dual control, which is you have a complex situation and you're trying to improve the decisions, but you're also spending some of your time testing some of your best tests to how to make it better. And so in the literature and operations research, it's sometimes called the 2 arm bandit, which is you see this slot machine and you don't know anything about it, but you have a fixed number of tokens to put in. So how do you play the game? Well, early on, you just try both of them kind of random, each arm, and you're trying to figure out which one is better. And as you get some early evidence, it's like a Bayesian thinking, you start to put more of your tokens to the arm that gives you better return. But occasionally you might not be completely right, so occasionally you continue to try to learn, and in it, if you will, for testing. And this study or this approach has been done with drug testing, and so it's still used in that way. But we saw the opportunity to bring that to consumer lenders, and so that became adaptive control, which turned into something called Triad. And I worked with a team to put that together, and that moved us to not just predicting, but to learn. And so that we spent a lot of time in the 90s to evolve that. But we were missing an important thing, which we didn't know how to mathematically model decisions to, quote, optimize a decision. So then we went from the 90s to the 2000s, and we worked on decision analytics. Sometimes these days it's called prescriptive analytics. And so we put that in place. And so to this day, that's, I'll call it the standard weaponry that B2C companies use in terms of business analytics to try to continue to improve. It becomes a loop, and to try to improve decisions. And so at that point, I became a research fellow, and I said, what's the next thing? Which is your question. What is the next thing?
Yes, exactly. Like it's another thing that when we spoke before earlier, I was really interested. It's like how was data science back on the 70s, and what's the difference from today? And not only that, like what do you see, like what's coming next?
Because I had the opportunity as a research fellow to think about these things, and so my current vision for what the business analytics, where is it going to go? What's the next thing? And I believe that thing is, I'm calling it behavior analytics. And if last I looked at behavior analytics in Wikipedia, it's awful. So I thought I would use that to do something real. And so we're calling that. And so I'd be happy to talk a bit, if you want to, about what's behavior analytics and what's it based on.
You're listening to Voices of Customer Experience. If you want more CX content, visit us at Worthix.com to download one of our customer experience ebooks, subscribe to our blog, and get our newsletter on the future of CX delivered to your inbox.
When you're talking about behavior analytics, it reminds me of customer experience. It reminds me of people. It's no longer like data and numbers and being analyzed by comparing different transactions. But when you're talking about behavior analytics, it reminds me of actual people doing things and buying things when they're doing. So yes, please tell us a little bit more about your vision about behavior analytics.
At Fair Isaac or FICO, we have always believed that business analytics is both art and science, and also that the ingredients that are critical as data, but more than data, just domain expertise. And we have continued to have that as part of our vision. So to your point, when you start to think and you try to understand more about people, and if you can get appropriate data and sometimes special data, then about how they behave, but also in some cases, what do they think about? And so that's the part of that attracted me to your Worthix story, because I think that's the next level. I would say that if you look at credit bureau data and you look about demographics and more to individual transactions, all of that data has been plowed many times from many different organizations. And so what's new? What's beyond that? And so I've currently, my best thinking about behavior analytics is it can be based on 4 pillars. And in the first pillar is behavioral economics, and it really describes how people to really make decisions. And also we now know from a lot of psychology and experiments, and Daniel Kahneman and Tversky, who pioneered behavior economics, and I think Daniel got a Nobel Prize for this, and trying to figure out what cognitive biases people have. So now we're talking about humans.
Yes.
And then also another part of economics is, can you design incentives? And I think of them as carrots and sticks. And so my favorite personal example is occasionally I want to have I call it a dry month of no alcohol. And so on the day 1, and generally with 1 or 2 of my sons, we make this pact that we are going to not drink alcohol for a month. And so what I realized in terms of an incentive for me is this: if I am not able to get through the month, I will write a $1,000 check to the NRA. I would rather die before write that check. And I've done this now for several years. We never miss on that month. So I just want to make a funny example of designing. And so you can often it's about carrots and
what a positive incentive.
Yeah, and that's the way most think. But I love this notion of, well, can you self-design some sticks that work for you? So I love that example. So that's one pillar. The second pillar is behavioral psychology. And people could say, well, what's the difference? Those 2 pillars are pretty close, and they actually are pretty close, except that behavioral economics is generally focused on economic decisions, whereas behavioral psychology looks at more of a life. And one of the things that they're interested in is, how do people motivate themselves, especially to make a change? And then if they can create new habits that they're trying to get, and then how do they sustain them? And I've got 2 favorite psychologists. They're both academics. And the one that I would refer to is B.J. Fogg, F-O-G-G. B.J. is 2 initials, and he's at Stanford. And if you put that in Google, you'll find his work, and he's got a behavioral model that says you've got to put together motivation, something that you can actually do, and the easier the better. And then you have to create a trigger that will trigger you toward that new. And if you can do those things in an appropriate way, you can get new habits and you can sustain them. When I understood his work, I thought it was astonishingly insightful. So that's the second pillar. The other one, by the way, and I'm the other. He's a behavioralist. He has a PhD, and he moved to Florida State recently, and he has focused mostly on distraction in driving. And that's something that I've been studying as part of a team at Fair Isaac. And so that's my second pillar. And the third one, I've called it is advanced gamification. And initially, personally, I hated it. I thought gamification, it's just a way, first of all, it's an ugly name or word, and it's about wasting time. But I saw a speaker who has thought about this, and I realized there was much, much more there. And the first thing that you have is the ability to create and engage and sustain engagement. And so I watch our 4 grandchildren, and they are into games, and I watched how this works in the people that know how to apply the principles of gamification. And then the book it's Chow, CHOU, and I'm going to come up with his, I think it's something like operational gamification or something like that. And he has made the point that this is about human-focused design. So as you made your point, we get closer and closer to real people and how they behave and what motivates them and how can you engage them and keep them engaged. And so he calls it human-focused design. And he observes that a lot of business applications, especially apps on a smartphone, they are process-focused. And so he has this, and so that's a third pillar.
And I guess that this is a third pillar because, and correct me if I'm wrong, like you talked about behavioral economics, which is how people make decisions related to economic decisions. And then behavioral psychology, which is basically more overall motivation and how people create sustainable habits. And when it comes to gamification, it's how do you design experiences to provoke the other 2 pillars to happen, right?
And I'll give you the one example from a different, actually, behavioralist at Florida State. And he did some study and said when it comes to like games that have leaderboards, and it's a tendency, it's not perfect, but there's a tendency that males tend to like to compete as individuals, whereas women like to compete as teams. And so that's just an example that comes right out of the research of these people, empirical research about what does work. And so it turns out that if, for instance, if you're trying to run more, say as a habit, if you've got an app that keeps track of your time and whatnot and your distance for a male, then an individual leaderboard is more effective. But for women, they would get together and make a group run, and they would like to see their results in that way. So it's these things, some of them are quite intuitive once you get them, but sometimes they're not intuitive.
To learn more on how companies such as Verizon, TechCrunch, Blizzard Studios, Volvo, and FICO are using our artificial intelligence and behavioral analytics to measure customer decisions through voice of customer surveys, visit Worthix.com.
And I guess like for those who are working with customer experience design, having this at least a basic notion about gamification, it's super important, because otherwise you could be designing an experience that would be amazing, as you said, for men, but not amazing or not engaging for women.
Yeah, and I think about Worthix. You care about this because you have a conversation, which is the 4th pillar, which is one-on-one bilateral conversations between a provider like a consumer or a marketer or a retailer versus their customers. And so when you engage, you start and you say you're focused on a small number of questions for less than 2 minutes, but you care about engagement so that they'll get all the way through those 6, 7, 8, 9 questions.
Yeah, we really care about the dialogue.
That's right.
And that would be your 4th pillar.
That's my 4th pillar. And so I would say that what you're doing in your solution today, as I understand it, a key element is how you've constructed and how you've tried to make that conversation with, I'll call it minimum friction. It'll be easy for the consumer to say, what do I care about? What are my interests? What matters to me? And your absolute dessert part is, why do I buy? And so you get beyond just what their interests are, but how do they think when they're going to make decisions? And so this is personalized communications, and I think, quite frankly, it's magic.
Yeah,
I think you're on to magic.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess our challenge is to definitely help companies to find the why behind the buy. And there was one story that I heard you telling yesterday during your presentation that happened, I guess, inside a bank or something, where you challenged the bank like several years ago.
Yes.
About how they could have individual conversations and how important it was. But like at that time, we didn't have enough technology to accomplish that. Can you tell that story very quickly?
Well, I would just say the start of market research, it was expensive to interview. And so focus groups to this day they're also expensive. But if you could have a conversation using technology so that you ask questions to make better, appropriate offers. And so the next action might not be a next offer. It could be just a question so you can understand more about them, so you can tune your communications, your offers, and the experience to be more effective. When I talked with this big bank, they could not imagine how to manage millions and millions and millions of personal one-on-one bilateral conversations because their mindset was back in the old technology. They didn't see what can be done now with smartphones and SMSs and other things, which is, of course, you're taking
AI, machine learning, and all that.
And you're taking full advantage of new, I call them fast and cheap and comfortable dialogue vehicles. And then, as you say, you use AI to try to figure out what's the next question based on the conversation to that point.
And that's part of our core belief. Like I've been working, as you know, with customer experience surveys over the past 17, probably now 18 years now. And we notice after all these years that most companies, when they're trying to understand customers, they're usually using an inside-out process where they get to decide what to ask based on the things they want to know about, instead of allowing the customer to talk about the things that are important for them. And I guess that our job as analysts or as suppliers or for companies and trying to help them to create better experiences is to help them to separate the wheat from the chaff based on the things that are important for the customer and not for us. Because everything starts and ends with the customer. And with the why behind the buy. So that's what we are trying to accomplish at Worthix. So thank you, Larry, a lot for your participation today. It's always a pleasure. I wish we could have more time to talk about more things, but for sure, in the near future, we could try again to see if you have some other availability in your schedule. And it was a pleasure.
I would look forward to that. And as I like to say, this is just the end of this part of the conversation. It doesn't mean the end of it.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed that amazing discussion. Join us next week to hear from Tamara Gaffney, Principal Analyst of Digital Insights at Adobe, to discuss how Adobe is shaping the future of CX.
Voices of Customer Experience is brought to you by Worthix.